Kentucky Ancestors Town Hall was filmed at the headquarters of the Kentucky Historical Society. Join us as we reveal Kentucky family mysteries, share tips from our experts, and learn about Kentucky history, telling Kentucky's story, one family at a time.
Welcome one and all to the Kentucky Ancestors Town Hall, sponsored and presented by the Kentucky Historical Society. I'm your host, Renee Shaw. It's a pleasure to be here. We have a fascinating story to share with you today, and it all revolves around our guest, Miss Ruby Booker, about an ancestor of yours who we're going to learn a great deal about today. So thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for asking.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about your Kentucky connections.
I was born and raised in Kentucky. And I lived there all my life, and I have 6 children, and we all still live here in Kentucky.
Yeah, and you have a couple who are here today.
Yes.
Your grandson, Eric, and your great-grandson, Josiah, 11 years old. So we're so glad to have you both here. And we have a young budding historian on the front row, Josiah. We're claiming it already because he has such a keen interest, asks you all kinds of questions.
Yes, he does.
And we know that you're very involved in history in LaGrange, Kentucky.
Yes.
And so this environment, it's good to have you at the table because you often help other people learn about their stories.
I try to.
Yes.
Because I volunteer at the Oldham County History Center, and you learn, when I started, I didn't know much of anything, but through the years that I've been there, Nancy has helped me, and Dot, a lady that I still know, and they have helped quite a bit to get me started.
Right, so we're going to help you today,
Good,
all right? How about that? So we're talking about Alexander Beaumont, and
Yes.
you have some facts about Alexander Beaumont.
Yes.
You knew he was a Union soldier during the Civil War, but you didn't have the answer to a couple of very important questions.
Yes.
Was Alexander born a slave? And if so, was he a free man prior to the end of the Civil War? Now, these are not easy questions to answer, as you know, because after all this time, there are a few things that the historical record can tell us about this man and his journey, but there are some things that are left out, okay? Our research team went to work right away, and today, for the first time, we're going to share his story with you and the world for that fact, okay?
Good.
Are you ready?
Yes.
So let's start with a look at Kentucky in the 19th century, the stage on which most of Alexander Beaumont's life would be played out. From its earliest days, Kentucky had been a slave state.
Yes.
In 1849, the year Alexander Beaumont was born, 1 out of 5 Kentuckians, almost 200,000 people, were slaves. Under the law, they were property to be bought and to be sold at will. In the South, any black or brown person was generally assumed to be a slave. Even those who were technically free were denied basic rights. Free persons of color in the South might be forbidden to do certain work or stay out past dark or even own dogs.
Yes.
So after the Dred Scott case was decided in 1857, when Alexander was about 8 years old at the time, African Americans were also denied citizenship, and the Supreme Court ruled that even slaves who escaped to a free state could be returned to servitude if they were captured. Kentucky was a slave state, but on the border between North and South. 2 of the presidential candidates, Abraham Lincoln and John C. Breckinridge, were Kentucky natives. And when the Civil War came, both sides would try to claim Kentucky for their own. In 1860, Lincoln and the Republicans won the presidency on a platform that opposed expanding slavery, but it left intact across the South. For Southern leaders, that was not good enough. And in the months after Lincoln took office, one state after another seceded from the Union to join the new Confederacy. In 1861, both Union and Confederate armies invaded western Kentucky, and a series of battles followed as the two sides contended for control of the state, which Lincoln considered essential to victory. When asked if he thought God was on the side of the Union, he's reported to have said, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." By 1863, the state was firmly in Union hands, and the federal government decided to establish a supply depot in the Bluegrass region in Jessamine County. It was called Camp Nelson, and it will become a very important place, especially for the man we're interested in finding out about, Alexander Beaumont. We've uncovered some fascinating clues in the historical record that will bring him out of the shadows. And do you have any stories, Ruby, that have come down through your family about Alexander that you remember?
No.
No, not at all. Well, we're going to hopefully answer some important questions. Let's take a closer look at the spot where Alexander Beaumont steps into history, and that's Camp Nelson. In 1863, just one bridge crossed the Kentucky River above Frankfort, Hickman Bridge, near Nicholasville in Jessamine County. In order to protect this key crossing and support a future invasion of the South, the United States Army established a supply depot nearby named for General William Bull Nelson, who had recently been murdered by a fellow officer. Camp Nelson would play a key role in both the Civil War and in African American history. During the war, the site included 4,000 acres, multiple fortifications, and 300 buildings. Today, it's designated as a national monument, historical museum and park, on the same level as places like Mammoth Cave, Lincoln's birthplace, and the Statue of Liberty. So let's get some additional insight. Let's turn toward the screen.
Well, Camp Nelson started in 1863 as a large Union Army supply depot and hospital and recruitment center for initially white troops from Kentucky and East Tennessee. And then in 1864, it became the state's largest and one of the nation's largest recruitment and training centers for African American soldiers who were known at that time as United States Colored Troops.
It was intended to be a supply depot for excursions into Western Virginia and Eastern Tennessee, as well as a training center.
These men got their freedom by enlisting in the Army. The initial ones actually escaped slavery and came into Camp Nelson to join the Army. Later on, recruitment parties went out to different farms and recruited men. The initial enlistment was for only free blacks and enslaved men with their owner's permission. And oftentimes these men came into Camp Nelson or other places to enlist, and they did not have their owner's permission, so the Army sent them back. And these men were particularly vulnerable for attack, and that actually led the Army to change their policy because of the violence that was shown towards these men that did not have their owner's permission.
Once they enlisted, they were considered free. The problem was getting here. In Nelson County, 8 men who tried to enlist were murdered. In Marion County, 2 men had their left ears cut off. Their ears were nailed to a tree as a deterrent to men trying to enlist. And in Lebanon, 15 men were whipped. By enlisting in the Union Army, those men made a statement toward their manhood, toward equal rights. I'm a soldier. I've put on the Union blue. I fought not only for my freedom, but for the preservation of this country. Therefore, I deserve some equal rights, some dignity and respect that should be given to all men. The location of Camp Nelson, although it was chosen because of its strategic location for the Union, it's also within about a 40-mile radius of counties that housed a number of slaves. This basically meant that with a hard day's walk, an escaped slave could reach Camp Nelson and seek freedom.
Many of these people self-emancipated themselves, both the soldiers and the women and children who escaped under very dangerous conditions to find freedom. And these men were willing to fight in the Army and potentially die to earn this freedom and a legacy of freedom for their children and really the rest of the Commonwealth.
Those of us who are alive today, we stand on the shoulders of those men. and we should not forget the sacrifices that they made.
So let's keep all that information in mind, Miss Ruby, as we turn back to how your ancestor fits into all of this. President Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which had declared freed slaves free in the Deep South, but not in Kentucky. But then America opened the door to freedom for African American men in Kentucky, like Alexander Beaumont. In early 1863, with battlefield losses rising, the War Department allowed the recruitment of slaves and free black men and promised freedom for those who enlisted. Camp Nelson became Kentucky's largest recruiting ground for black soldiers and eventually one of the largest in the nation. After the Dred Scott decision, no state was a safe refuge for escaped slaves who could guarantee their freedom only if they crossed the border into Canada. One slave who was freed at Camp Nelson when he joined the Army reputedly said, "See how much better off we was now than we were 4 years ago? It used to be 500 miles to get to Canada from Lexington, but now it's only 18 miles. Camp Nelson is our Canada." Many Kentuckians were concerned about the idea of arming slaves, as you can imagine, whether or not they were in the Army. Union General Jeremiah Boyle, the commander of the Department of Kentucky, warned President Lincoln that the recruitment of slaves would, quote, revolutionize the state and do infinite and inconceivable harm. Ordinary citizens, even those who professed loyalty to the Union, were just as vocal in their complaints. Nevertheless, the enlistment of African Americans began in February 1864. Loyal slave owners were to receive $300 for each slave who volunteered for the Army, and fugitive slaves were also pressed into the service. The countryside near Camp Nelson was home to thousands of slaves. Just across the Kentucky River, Garrard County was home to 3,500 enslaved African Americans, more than a third of the county's total population. 325 of them would enlist at Camp Nelson. And one of them, Miss Ruby, was Alexander Beaumont. The journey could be perilous. When a group of 250 enslaved men left Danville in May 1864 to march to Camp Nelson, local residents threw stones and shot pistols at the recruits, who ultimately reached the camp safely. Meanwhile, Alexander Beaumont's home in Garrard County was less than 20 miles away. He likely faced danger on his own journey to the camp. But he made it. The photo on the screen was taken from the Garrard County side of the bridge where Alexander lived. On June 3, 1864, Alexander Beaumont, age 25, crossed the bridge and joined Company E of the 116th Regiment of the United States Colored Infantry. According to his military service records, Beaumont served as a company cook for much of his duty. Now, Ruby, what do you think about how determined your ancestor was to join the Army?
He was really determined to make that trip across that bridge, because he had even been killed, or stoned or anything, and come up missing, and nobody know what happened to him.
Yeah, so lots of courage that Alexander displayed.
He had a lot.
Yeah, he was definitely a very brave man. And he was also part of an important story in American history. In all, there were 175 regiments designated as United States colored troops, some 178,000 men. Their commissioned officers were all white, and opportunities for promotion were limited for African American soldiers. During the course of the war, they sustained more than their share of casualties, but fought with distinction. 15 were awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration attainable by a member of the armed forces. Although the 116th USCT, as it was called, was organized in central Kentucky, the regiment did not serve in the Bluegrass State. Instead, military authorities sent these slave-turned soldiers to Virginia, near the Confederate capital of Richmond
Oh.
to battle the seasoned veterans of General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. In late 1864, the 116th USCT arrived in Virginia and took part in the Siege of Petersburg, a harrowing experience for many of the new African American recruits. Petersburg was vital to the Confederacy and was heavily defended. In a preview of tactics that would be important in World War I, both sides constructed elaborate trenches, many of which were dug by the African American regiments. In July of 1864, Union commanders devised a novel plan to break open Confederate defenses. Using former coal miners in the ranks, they dug a long tunnel under the Confederate lines and planted a massive underground explosive. Ooh. A division of the colored troops was specially trained for an assault to take place as soon as the mine exploded, but at the last minute, Union commanders replaced them with untrained white troops.
Oh.
The explosion succeeded in blowing a crater in the rebel lines, but the Union assault was disorganized and slow. Although Alexander Beaumont's regiment did not participate in the attack on the crater, multiple other African American Union regiments did. And when they charged into the open pit, dozens were shot down. The Union soldiers were repulsed, and after the assault, Confederate defenders murdered many of the African American troops who tried to surrender. Beaumont's regiment went on to endure much carnage and casualties at Petersburg, where they were part of the largest African American fighting force assembled during the war. After Petersburg finally fell to a Union army under General Ulysses S. Grant, the regiment joined the Union advance on Richmond. They fought at Hatcher's Run and during the Appomattox campaign, which ultimately led to the surrender of Robert E. Lee's army on April 9, 1865. Throughout this final campaign of the Civil War, the Confederate forces, weakened by casualties, disease, and desertions, were routinely outnumbered by Union troops. The Union advantage was due in part to soldiers like Alexander Beaumont. By the end of the war, the United States colored troops made up fully 10% of the Army's total strength. Of all the African Americans enlisted in the Army, full 20%, some 36,000 men, died during the war, a mortality rate that was 1/3 higher than white soldiers. But Alexander Beaumont survived. After the Civil War, authorities sent his regiment to Texas, where it served along the Rio Grande River. On January 17, 1867, the 116th USCT was mustered out of the service at Louisville. Oh. Beaumont, who remained with the regiment throughout his period, also left the Federal Army in January of 1867. So Ruby, what's your reaction to all this you've learned so far?
Oh, it's unbelievable.
It's unbelievable,
Yes,
isn't it?
It's just unbelievable.
Unfortunately, records that pertain to the early lives of Kentucky slaves, they're scarce. Mm-hmm. Some military records give no indication of his status. In fact, one note on his enlistment record reads, "Status of this man, whether free or slave, when enlisted, not known."
Right.
Sounds familiar, right?
Yes.
So Ruby, tell us about the challenges that you faced in trying to find out the truth about your ancestor.
Oh, it's not as bad today as it was when I first started looking for him. I couldn't find hardly anything.
Right.
I even went to the museums in Louisville, and everything that I would go to, it would send me overseas.
Interesting.
And the Cresses and the Beaumont's family. And then by accident, I happened to go to Camp Nelson with a group, and there was a man there. He was in one of the films that he knew of Alex Beaumont. And he gave me some information. And from there, I found quite a bit about him.
Right.
Only thing that I haven't found is when he died. I haven't found out the date that he died.
Right. Well, there's more to this story.
Oh.
More to come. Let's hear from one of our experts about how to uncover family histories like yours.
When researching our Kentucky ancestors, many of the relationship details we need to track down can be found in the records generated after a death. Beyond a death certificate, additional documents that pertain to the property left behind were filed with the county court and often referred to as probate records. The act of probating an estate was designed to legally administer or distribute the owner's property after their death and may include filing of the decedent's will, dividing property, appraisal of the estate contents, selling off personal goods, and listing outstanding debts. Throughout this process, there were details gathered about the deceased that can tell us a lot about their life, such as related family members, their socioeconomic status, the location of their property, and what the boundaries looked like. Here are a few things to keep in mind when using probate records. The entire probate process could take a few years to complete and usually began with the filing of the will written by the deceased. The person appointed as estate administrator, called the executor, would bring the will to court as an indication the death had occurred. This will served as a written set of instructions that outlined the wishes of the deceased in regards to how their estate was to be divided among designated living heirs. Some people died without a will, which is often referred to as intestate, but the lack of a will did not halt the probate process. It carried on, moving to an estate appraisal, which included a detailed inventory of the property contents, then to an estate settlement, which listed who purchased the inventoried items at a sale, or terms of an agreed upon division of property, all signed by the executor and court clerk, rendering the probate process complete. So what kind of family details can you hope to find within probate records? Most probate files will provide valuable family clues, but if you're lucky, your ancestors' records may contain multiple pages of pertinent information, including the names and relationships of family members. Even if there is no will, some of the property divisions, debts listed, or sale items can mention family connections. Plus, if your ancestor was an enslaved member of the household, their name and age may be included in the will, estate inventory, or settlement. In conclusion, be sure to add probate records to your list of frequently used sources.
Some great information there,
Yes.
Ms. Ruby.
Yes,
and
it
so
is.
now we want to return back to the story of Alexander Beaumont. Other records at Camp Nelson confirm Alexander came there as a slave. When he joined the Union Army, he listed his owner as William Beaumont. In another record, his enslaver is listed as Susan Beaumont.
Yes.
You knew that,
Yeah.
okay? That means he more than likely escaped his master or mistress to join the Union Army. Documents we uncovered tell us that there were William and Susan Beaumont, an elderly married couple who lived in Garrard County on a large farm. According to an 1860 slave schedule, William Beaumont owned 4 enslaved people: a 40-year-old woman, a 14-year-old girl, and 2 men, aged 23 and 20. Because Alexander Beaumont said he was 25 years old when he enlisted in 1864, he is likely the 20-year-old enslaved man listed in the 1860 slave schedule. He might have never had the chance to get to Camp Nelson but for a stroke of fate. In 1863, William Beaumont died without a will. This meant that his estate, including his slaves, was divided among his wife, children, and other heirs, and much of his personal property was sold at public auction. That auction would put Alexander and the other enslaved people living on the Beaumont farm in grave danger. Had they been sold, they could have been sent into the Deep South to work on cotton or sugar plantations. They would have very likely have been separated, as thousands of other family and friends were. But according to the estate inventory and subsequent auction records we were able to find, Alexander and the other slaves were not sold. Instead, they were hired out for a fee, with one slave going to the Beaumont son, Herod, to work. Because his service record notes that he was owned by Susan Beaumont, we believe the widow retained ownership of Alexander after her husband died. It's also possible that being hired out gave Alexander a precious opportunity to escape. He likely would have lived at the Beaumont farm, working on a neighboring farm and traveling back and forth, and he would have a pass for travel, giving him some protection from local authorities and slave patrols. Well, now, what might have happened to the other Beaumont slaves? In addition to helping settle Alexander's status as a slave, the estate sale after William Beaumont's death is important because it gives a personalized view into the sadness and the tragedy of slavery, and it gives us a few precious scraps of information about the people who were owned by the Beaumont family. While census records simply list the age and the gender of the enslaved, the estate inventory provides the names and monetary value of the Beaumont family slaves. Okay, their hopes and their fears, their accomplishments, and their very faces, they've been lost to us, but we know this much. There was Judah, age 50, who was valued at $250. America, age 20, was valued at $500. George, who was 22, was valued at $600. And finally, the 24-year-old Alexander was valued at $600. While Alexander escaped to Camp Nelson and found freedom, what happened to the other enslaved people living on the Beaumont farm? Well, census records show that George and Judah Beaumont lived together in the same household in the decades after the Civil War. They were mother and son. Okay, this family relationship also shows the potential horror that could have befallen them when their owner, William Beaumont, died. Had George been auctioned off and sold to the Deep South, for example, it's probable that Judah would have never seen her son again. Fortunately for this mother and son, they were not sold and separated. Instead, they remained together in the decades after the Civil War.
My goodness.
The fate of the 20-year-old America, however, is unknown. Census records may not reveal her whereabouts because she could have married or taken another name, or she simply just may have died. Sadly, her fate is lost to history. We do know what happened to Alexander Beaumont after the Civil War, and we believe we can answer the question his descendants posed. As we've said, he was mustered out of the military in January 1867 after serving in Virginia and in Texas. After the Civil War, he moved to LaGrange, Kentucky, where he married Lucy Fibble in October of 1868. You know that.
Yeah.
Alexander and Lucy had 6 children, and you almost said their names before when we were talking. I'm going to repeat them. George.
Yes.
Jenny.
Yes.
Callie.
Yeah. Oh.
You said Katie, but we have record of Callie.
Okay.
Could be Katie.
Yeah.
John.
Yes.
Claude.
Yes.
And Charles.
Yes.
Those names are familiar to you. Now, we do not know just how Alexander Beaumont died. Although he has a military gravestone in the LaGrange Historical African American Cemetery, it does not include his birth and death dates, right? Yeah. But thanks to military pension records, we do know that he died sometime between 1880 and 1888, the year that his wife, Lucy, filed for a widow's pension, okay? We could say that legally, Alexander Beaumont was freed on December 6, 1865, when the 13th Amendment was finally ratified and every former slave in the United States became legally free. But the truth is, Miss Ruby, his journey, Alexander Beaumont's, was one of self-liberation. Although it was a perilous undertaking, as we've heard, his desire for freedom overrode any fears that he may have had. Born in bondage, his agency, his bravery, his self-determination gave him control over his fate and his life. And when he made the journey to Camp Nelson, marching northward to put on the uniform of the United States, he freed himself. Now, we have shown you many images and documents today, but there is one last very special thing that we want to share with you. And I'll need some help from Miss Sherry, who we saw just a moment ago on the film, to help us out with this. And let's make room, because she's got a pretty big surprise here.
Oh.
Now, can you guess what this is, Miss Ruby?
No.
Dare not? This is the original registration book from Camp Nelson, from when Alexander Beaumont registered.
Oh my God.
Can you believe it?
No.
Now let me point out something to you. Look for number 41.
41.
Okay? What does that say, Miss Ruby?
Alex Beaumont, private, let's see, town, Garrard, Kentucky, farmer. June the 3rd. Oh my God. Oh,
Isn't this amazing?
God. Yes. Oh my God.
And of course, now you may notice that the spelling on Beaumont is spelled differently than how, right? And
Yes.
just an officer made that translation. But isn't this amazing
Yes.
to have this artifact?
Yeah, I've seen it spelt like this before. It's 2 or 3 different ones that they have spelled.
And they spell it here for the sake of our audience. Is it B-O-M-O-N-T?
Yes, the way it sounds.
The way it
Beaumont.
sounds, Beaumont, right? But instead of the B-E-A-U. Well, what is your response? Have we answered all your questions, Miss Ruby?
Yes.
Well, it's quite amazing. I mean, the fact Alexander Beaumont's story is tremendous, and to know that you are an ancestor of his and this rich legacy of service that he leaves and to your family and to our country.
Yeah, that gives me cold chills.
Doesn't it? Well, that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
And hopefully young Josiah sitting in this audience, I want him to see this too, because this is something really special that I hope you take stock of, young man.
See here, 41.
41.
See, it's it right here. It's my great-great-grandfather. He was a foreman. And he's sitting there.
Isn't that awesome? It's pretty cool. And we know that Josiah, as we said, has an interest in this, and we hope that you all will keep this kind of enthusiasm going. Thank you, Miss Ruby. Thank you, Josiah, for coming up to say hello to us and capturing this really important moment in history. It has been a pleasure, Miss Ruby, to be up here with you today and to go on this exploration of Alexander Beaumont. Thank you. Give her a round of applause, please.
Oh my goodness.
Isn't that great?
Yes, that is.
Well, while she's still taking it all in, we want to thank all of you for being here, all of you for watching today's Kentucky's Ancestors Town Hall. I'm Renee Shaw on behalf of the Kentucky Historical Society. Thank you for watching. Make sure you visit the Kentucky History Museum and the center here to learn all about the great history that awaits you, that maybe there's a family connection of your own. Take good care.
Amen. This is great.
That's awesome.
This is great.